Lovers of lore, thank you for joining me for this installment of the Brothers War story. Now, it's important to note for this one that this actually takes the final 2 parts of the story and combines them together. So this will be the final episode of the Brothers War story. And as usual with this, we're going to be jumping around time-wise. So the story actually starts at the beginning of the process of sorting out what they're going to do in terms of the Silex. Where do they start? The Silex is essentially, in most ways, a myth. What happened with it was so momentous that religions sprung up around it. There's so many ideas floating around out there about its creation. An old scholar named Felden created it. No, Ashnod was the one who made it, and she made it out of a part of Mishra's skullcap. Others said Gix brought it all the way from the oily lakes of Phyrexia, and other people would say it was actually chiseled from a giant's tooth by the kobolds of Care Keep. There were tons and tons of these stories. It's the Tear of Tal crystallized. The list was endless. So Teferi found his actual answers in the old manuscript that was written by Caleb bin Krug. The last battle of the Brothers' War fought on Argoth was where the Silex was last used. So they start to go through the process of experimenting with the temporal anchor that Saheeli has created. And Teferi ends up not being able to sleep for weeks, or at least feeling like he hasn't slept for weeks. He can't even tell. These time experiments are taking a massive toll on him. So Saheeli's idea is to separate the soul from the body instead of physically sending someone back through time. But the experience itself is horrifying. Having your soul pulled from your body time and time again is wearing on Teferi. And that, combined with his dread over tampering with time, left him feeling very drained. And you know from the previous stories, he was hopping around from different locations. He's in 85 AR, then 28 AR, then 44 AR, witnessing all of these different horrors. And as he's doing this, he becomes more adept at finding the different tears in the tapestry of time where so many lives have ended. That's how they're trying to find the last battle. So the events that we're about to talk about take place on the night of the Phyrexian attack that we talked about in the last story, where that's when Teferi finds the right spot that he's looking for, the last battle. But he sees it on his way back through time, headed back to Saheeli's workshop. So when he arrives, he lets them know, I saw it, I know where I need to go. But Saheeli is uncomfortable. She's unsure the anchor is still even usable at this point. And if the anchor fails, there's no telling what will happen to Teferi and Gaia. Teferi could find a fate worse than death as his soul and spark are severed. Who knows where they would go? But ultimately, they decide to accept this risk, and back in Teferi goes. And this time, he's in the right place. 63 AR, the Isle of Argoth, the place of the final war between the brothers. And he's there at the right moment. Urza is sitting there with the Silex in his lap. Blood is pooling in it from his cut forehead, and he's weeping as a gigantic Mishra/dragon engine is barreling down towards him. So as they're watching this unfold, all the possibilities that might activate the Silex are being analyzed. Is it a resonance between the two brothers? Is it the heightened emotion of the situation? Is it the Phyrexian equipment? Is it the rain? And during all of this, Gaia comments on how human Urza seems. Watching him cry over the loss of his brother really does hit home that Urza was originally just a regular human man. And then the Silex blast initiates, and at this point, it's too much for Teferi, and he bellows, "Stop!" And then he comes staggering out of the temporal anchor and starts throwing up on the floor while Gaia is consoling him. She had the shared experience. She can see what Teferi is going through. She may not have his exact memories, but she can see the strain that it's putting on him. So Teferi only takes enough time to eat a few crackers, and and then he's right back into the machine. But you have to understand, this is all happening during that Phyrexian attack. And Gaia, who is normally pretty jovial, she's really somber right now. This is our last chance. So back in he goes. Teferi looks around. They're in the right place. Mishra, once again, is charging towards a tearful Urza. At this point, Teferi uses his temporal magic, and he divides time into infinite pieces to study what was happening. Essentially, it gives him an infinite amount of time to look at everything from any number of angles and try and figure out what he can do to activate the Silex. What tiny little piece of information is missing. But ultimately, no matter how long he spent doing this, he couldn't glean anything useful. He didn't know what else to do, so he decided to take a massive gamble. He was going to unfreeze time. He didn't know if his soul and Planeswalker Spark would be able to withstand the Silex blast. So there was a real risk that he would be destroyed doing this. But nonetheless, with what was on the line, he decides to allow time to resume its flow and remain there. So Teferi ends up in essentially a formless void in the middle of the Silex blast with Urza. And Urza is actually disintegrating in real time. The Silex blast is destroying his body. His flesh is melting off, and Teferi's talking to him. He says, "I have news for you from the future, and it's not good news." And from Urza's response, Teferi can tell that he's not physically in pain from what's happening to him, because Urza says, "One does not expect happy news in a formless void," which feels dry and clever to me. It's fun. After that, he says, "Will talking to me change the future?" And Teferi says, "I don't know." Teferi goes on to explain, "You're a great man about to become something greater. You were my teacher once." And Urza says, "How are we here?" Teferi shrugs and says, "I don't know." To which Urza responds, "I must not be a good teacher then." I love that exchange. Teferi goes on to explain about the Phyrexian situation, and Urza didn't know that these were Phyrexians at this point. So he gets that terminology brought into his mind and goes, "These are the individuals we're dealing with," and ultimately is brought over to Teferi's way of thinking and explains to him how he can use the Silex, even though Urza will ultimately be responsible for everything that happens with all of these Phyrexians. So Urza accepts his role. He goes ahead and explains to Teferi how the Silex works. Basically, he became a conduit for the land and poured everything of himself into the Silex. Now, Teferi, hearing this, is horrified because obviously he knows tons about magic and realizes that means there's no secret here. The activation of the Silex is far more simple than originally thought, and in a lot of ways, this has been wasted time. Now, this conversation with Urza actually happens in a sort of pocket dimension. So it's not happening in real time. And this pocket dimension starts to fragment and shatter apart. The sky cracks, the void ushers in, Urza's gone, and actually the next part of the story is literally word for word taken from the Brothers War novel. And since I covered that part in the previous Brothers War series, it's the whole thing with Tanos, all that stuff. You can go and check out the original series. There's no point in me telling you literally the exact same story. They even gave Jeff Grubb a writing credit for that because they're putting in a big chunk of that story, all right? So that's what happens in that regard. Now we return back. We've got the situation where the Phyrexian attack is ongoing. We don't know what the deal is with Teferi, but Nissa, Chandra, Saheeli, and Gaia are all talking about their current situation. The Mirrans over on New Phyrexia are ready to launch an attack. It's going to happen in 2 days at most. Preparations are being made. Sorin and Arlen are over on Innistrad working on the defenses there. Samit and Hazaret have hidden the people of Amoket. Jace is out there recruiting all kinds of different planeswalkers. They even mention Ty Verkel and make fun of the fact that he doesn't like to wear shirts. So it works like this. Once everything's ready on Ravnica and Jace arrives, they are out of time. Saheeli explains about the Silex and Teferi and that they need more time. The Silex will be needed to destroy the Phyrexian world tree. At that point, arguments break out about destroying the entirety of New Phyrexia or just the World Tree, because the World Tree will be the portal that the Phyrexians use to get elsewhere, but wiping them out entirely also seems like a good idea to people like Chandra, where Nissa, on the other hand, says, what about the individuals who are innocent? What about the Mirrans? And Saheeli is more on that side. So they're not all in agreement, but ultimately the argument breaks off when Teferi arrives looking gaunt and pale. Now, later that night was the Phyrexian attack that we talked about previously, where Elspeth and Joda took out a whole bunch of Phyrexians. Well, in this case, Nissa and Ren are behind mopping up the leftovers that weren't destroyed by Elspeth and Joda. And they see off in the distance that massive pillar of light, which was used when they destroyed that Phyrexian behemoth. Now, this makes Nissa want to go and check on them, but Ren blocks her. Our job is to guard Teferi. And Nissa ultimately relents, and they turn around to head back. But then there is a loud noise above, so Ren stands guard at the door. So Nissa goes to see what's going on and spots another wave of Phyrexians, at least another 100 Phyrexian knights, and they're led by a bone angel. So Nissa runs back to report to Ren, and at that point she also activates the constructs that were left behind by Elspeth. She knows the command words, so she tells them to arise, and they get into defensive positions. So magical bolts start being fired at these troops, but it turns out that the Bone Angel is pretty powerful and can actually enact protective wards. So they can see it chanting, and the magic is just bouncing off of them. But Nissa realizes, hey, this is no problem for elementals. So she reaches down to the earth and nature spirits of Dominaria, willing the earth and stone to life. But unexpectedly, the nature spirits pull back. And Nissa's stunned by this. It's never happened to her before. And Ren can actually feel what's going on as well. She says, the ley lines here feel tangled, and it seems like it's been done on purpose. So Nissa instead relies on the constructs that she has and orders them forwards into the Phyrexians. But things went badly from this point because these Phyrexians are organized and reinforced with magic. That Bone Angel is totally capable of turning these into little organized units of Phyrexians, so they start hacking apart the constructs with ease. So Nissa comes up with a plan to deal with the leader. She casts a growth spell on Ren and Seven, specifically on the tree body 7, with the idea that she's going to climb up it to get to this Bone Angel. But Ren has different ideas and says, you're going to be seen if you climb. And then immediately says, 7, make her fly. And before Nissa can object, 7 reaches down with his giant wooden arm and whips Nissa up in the air at the Bone Demon. Now she is hurtling towards this Bone Angel at a velocity that is so quick that the rain is pelting into her face and it's hurting. It feels like it's stabbing into her. So as she's flying towards this Bone Angel, at the last moment, it sees that she's coming and it tries to twist out of the way, but no luck. Nissa latches onto it and drives her sword into its side, and it's trying to maneuver, but ultimately it can't do anything. It loses control of its troops and starts to fly up into the storm clouds, and Nissa just starts going crazy. She pulls her sword out and starts jamming it into the angel's side over and over again, and each time she's doing this, it's also planting a little seed inside the angel's body. So Nissa wills all of the seeds to bloom at once, and the Bone Angel's body starts to shake and shudder and rack as parts of it are blown off by these seedlings bursting forth from its body. Ultimately, the demon starts to crash to the ground. Nissa leaps off, preparing to planeswalk, but Ren and 7 runs out like a baseball player and catches her mid-fall. But they both get swarmed by Phyrexians at this point. So Nissa calls out to Dominaria for aid. Why won't you help us? And Dominaria responds, you are not Gaia's child. You are invaders. And then visions of war despoiling nature overwhelmed Nissa as the voices accused, you are here to steal our strength. But Nissa fought back. I'm a protector. And she opened her mind and experiences to the presence that was within her and showed them what she was made of. She showed her dedication to nature, but still the presence didn't relent. The Silver One promised to take the Silex away. You are liars. Nissa had enough. She said, if you're not going to help me deal with your enemies, send me back. I'll do it myself. And this was enough to bring Gaia onto Nissa's side. So all of a sudden, hope and power flood into Nissa. Massive verdant energy flow out of her as Nissa and Gaia become one. All of the fallen Phyrexian constructs and all of the other constructs that were commanded by Nissa all rise up. They've been transformed into living heartwood elementals. While all this is happening, Gaia's presence is inside Nissa's mind, and her rage and sadness are building ever higher to the point where Nissa literally couldn't handle it, and she screams until she blacks out for a moment. And then she's suddenly back in the battle. Phyrexians are howling all around her. The living wood elementals surge into battle, and for every Phyrexian that they tear down and destroy, it rises up as a living wood elemental, joining their ranks against the rest of the Phyrexians. So the ground-bound troops are in a lot of trouble on Phyrexia's side. And Ren and Seven sweeps up Nissa, and they start to head back towards Teferi at this point, trusting the elementals to wrap up that situation. But they end up encountering the mangled body of the Bone Angel. It's still trying to destroy them, clawing towards them, but the vines from Nissa's plants are still growing out of it. And she gestures, and the vines start to wrap around the Bone Angel's throat, choking it out. And Ren intercedes and says, stop, this isn't your nature. But inside her voice, Gaia spoke to her, no, this isn't your nature, but it must be. The dead are lost forever. Victory will be paid in blood. And then the presence of Gaia departed, and Nissa was left alone, staring at the Bone Angel. Even broken, she realized it was a danger, a seed for Phyrexia. She thought about what she would have to do. She thought about a Johnny and how he might be lost too, and how she would do whatever it took to win. And at that point, she closed her eyes and grimly closed her fist. And the Bone Angel died horrifically. This is brutal. This determination of Nissa is incredibly epic. I love it. So you end up with Nissa and Ren running into Saheeli's workshop. Now Nahiri and Jace have arrived at this point. They're there with Saheeli and Kea. They're standing over the temporal anchor, which is smoking and ruined. The Weatherlight's power stone had just imploded, and the anchor started to warp and couldn't handle the strain. So they run over to the coffin to retrieve Teferi from inside of it. He was pale and distressed, and then they realized, actually, he's fading away. And before anybody could open the coffin, Ren steps forward and stops them. She can feel his energy. He's still tethered to it. She can hear his song. And Jace backs that up. He touches Teferi's mind and says he's there, but very distant, as if he's across many planes. So Saheeli starts to say, I'll rebuild the anchor. We'll bring him back. Jace cuts her off and says they have no time. Kea believes she has a rough idea of how it works, even though the feelings did come through garbled, so she's not 100%. Joda at this point arrives and says that he will look after Teferi so the rest can depart for New Phyrexia. Now Jace can't read Joda's mind, which makes him uneasy. Joda ends up chiding Jace, basically pointing out that it's pretty rude, as the first thing mind mages do is read other minds. Sure, it makes you comfortable, but it is not a considerate thing to do. And Jace actually is somewhat abashed by this. Ren agrees that she is going to stay with Teferi as well as Joda, and more planeswalkers start to arrive. You have Vraska, the Wanderer, Kato, Tyvar, Mr. Shirtless, Luca, they all show up. Jace creates a telepathic link between all of them as part of a strike force, and they spend some time getting acquainted with each other, and then after that, they depart as a group for New Phyrexia. And the story ends off with Teferi waking up on an unknown beach on a warm, sunny day. The birds are chirping, he could feel the heat and the sand, which made him realize, wait, I'm not in the temporal anchor anymore. He was in the flesh, but where? He could see that there were footprints nearby. The place had to be inhabited. He tried to speak with Gaia in his mind, but there was nothing. He hoped desperately that she had heard the conversation with Urza and knew how to activate the Silex. He could already feel the memories of his conversation with Urza fading. In fact, he was starting to wonder, what was it that I'm forgetting? So at that point, Teferi turns, sees the footsteps, and follows them off to find people and hope. And my friends, that's how this story ends. I hope that you enjoyed it. This was a pretty epic way to end things off. If you enjoy what we're doing here, then support the channel by joining the Patreon or the channel membership. Go watch some more lore because stories are great times. After all, remember, my friends, lore is life.